This is Thought in Motion, a series dedicated to the seminars of psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. Today's video covers lectures 22 to 24 in Seminar 2. These final three lectures consist of many at times intense and even seemingly abrasive exchanges between Lacan and those who are regular attendees to the seminar, as well as a more traditional talk delivered to a broader audience as part of a lecture series given that year. Though the back and forth exchanges were challenging to follow, a certain coherence arises across the three final lectures that I will present here today in the video. And so the following questions will be addressed. 1. How does science emerge from the real? 2. What are the two meanings of language? 3. What is the relationship between the subject and language? And 4, what are symptoms and treatment in light of this understanding of language and the subject? The real is something that is always in the same place, that is, always present. Before the modern period, there was a relation to the real that assumed we played some role in this order, and thus it demanded a kind of human action through various rituals or ceremonies or speech acts. These acts were not for the sake of preserving the real, which doesn't depend on us. However, our lack of participating in them was thought to possibly lead to a disturbance in the real. This relation to the real changes as we come to believe our actions have nothing to do with the order of things, that we couldn't directly disturb the real. It was at this point that the exact sciences emerged, that is, the science of physics and the mathematical laws governing it. Though we do not rule over it, we gain a certain power to manipulate the real by becoming servants to nature, like the slave who makes the master dependent on him by serving him well. So we adhere to its so-called natural laws, and in doing so, are granted the ability to bring about particular outcomes within the bounds of these laws. With the exact sciences is introduced the great clock of nature, which inaugurates the universe of precision. And this so-called clock of nature necessitates a standardized unit of measurement. A small number of symbols are then brought together that ultimately have little to do with the real. Even the notion of time zones didn't exist prior to this. And in fact, I believe time zones were created following the emergence of trains, which required a sort of standardized measurement of time for them to run properly on a schedule. The standardization of time and the imposition of precise measurement in general has come to uniquely define us. These little symbols that emerge from the exact sciences produce what is a symbolic language. It's a language without subjectivity and is best exemplified by the logic of machines or the logic of autonomous algorithms. To illustrate this point, Lacan again takes up an example, sort of like what he discussed regarding the game of odds and evens, this time using a simplified example of doors being open or shut. Without getting into the particularities of the example, the overall point is the same, which is to illustrate how language contains a world of laws independent of subjectivity. Imaginary language, in contrast, introduces a human element into this symbolic language, delivering to language its weight and its emotional vibration. This language is composed of certain choice images that have specific relations with the living existence of the human being, including its biological reality and relations with others. These images stabilize and concretize language and verbal exchange. At the same time, it continuously interrupts, contradicts, and blocks off the symbolic discourse, giving rise to our distinctly human difficulties, introducing inertia and sowing discord. Lacan calls it an impurity in the development of the mathematical symbolic. For this reason, language becomes an obstacle to the progressive realization of the subject in the symbolic order. So what then is the subject? The subject originally emerges from the symbolic. within which it is still inscribed and determined. Lacan calls the subject an atom of concrete discourse that emerges even before being born. The symbolic is introduced into the human animal because of a fundamental gap that leaves our imaginary relation to the world incomplete. Consequently, the images in it are capable of being subsumed by the symbolic, but in such a way as to lead to a split subject. This subject remains linked to and determined by symbolic language, while at the same time is recognized and identified through the imaginary function of language. However, this is also where the problems come in. The split leads to a large dimension of the symbolic language becoming repressed. The function of the subject is to rediscover its place within the symbolic order insofar as that subject is determined by it. Doing so, the subject must decipher it and give a meaning to its laws. It's through speech, operating on language, that the subject does this. Prior to being realized in speech, the repressed discourse of the symbolic order is non-existent. This does not mean that it's inert. Rather, it operates as a kind of repetitive insistence seeking to be recognized, that is, seeking to be brought into being. Hence why the repetition compulsion and the death drive are, in general, situated on the side of the symbolic, and as what goes beyond the pleasure principle, which is associated with the imaginary and the ego. This shows how speech is not simply demonstrative, pointing out what is there already in the unconscious, but rather it's creative. Speech brings what is not into being. This is why there's a prolonged back and forth in lectures 22 and 24 concerning the meaning of the initial lines of the Gospel of John, where it states, "In the beginning was the Word," which Lacan interprets to refer to speech. In other words, in the beginning is the creative function of speech that brings being out of non-being. Though the exchange around this interpretation seems to get overly focused on its legitimacy from the point of view of biblical scholarship, the point Lacan is trying to make concerns the creative function of speech within psychoanalysis. That recognition is not about some sort of platonic reminiscence, that is, discovering something always already there but hidden in the depths. Instead, the recognition of what is repressed is at the same time the act of creation, as it gives meaning to the symbolic discourse, which is what I believe Lacan means when he says that these meanings are how we introduce ourselves into the temporal succession. In other words, it introduces a beginning rather than a rediscovery of what was always already there, even if that beginning is only retroactively placed there through speech. These meanings created by speech reveal to us that we're not masters of our own house, that there is something into which we are integrating ourselves, and that which we are integrating ourselves into is what has been repressed. Repression itself is the basis for neurosis. In neurosis, the discourse between the subject and the big other, who for the most part here is equivalent to the symbolic itself, is interrupted as it passes through the imaginary and encounters the ego's resistance. The ego is what Lacan calls the mainspring of the interruptions of this discourse. Yet this interrupted discourse insists, despite these resistances. So the real point of conflict is not so much between consciousness and unconsciousness as it is between the ego's resistance and the repetition of the repressed discourse of which the ego is the main obstacle. Symptoms then are the inverse side of this repressed discourse. They are significations that express the truth of the discourse, but in an unformulated fashion. Lacan clearly states what psychoanalysis is not. It's not a matter of becoming a good person, co-adaptation, rectification, or normalization. Instead, it's the liberation of meaning in the discourse within which the subject is situated. To do this, the analysts must themselves be situated in the position of the big other. That is, being what is most inaccessible. This allows transference between the ego and the big other to occur, insofar as the little other is not present there to resist it. And the little other would be the analyst's ego. And hence why Lacan often says that resistance is first caused by the analyst and not the analysan. In doing this, and by interpreting the discourse between the ego and the big other, the analysan can begin to experience what Lacan calls a harmonic vibration with the fundamental speech that's going from big other to the subject, as that discourse is allowed to pass without as much interruption. To the extent the ego comes into agreement with this fundamental discourse, the ego then gradually gets linked to the subject, allowing the ego to become what it wasn't and to arrive where the subject is. Lacan does not seem to be suggesting that we get rid of the ego, even if such a thing were possible. Acquiring new meanings is only part of the process of addressing symptoms. There's also the need to reintegrate the newly acquired sequence of significations back into the imaginary continuum of the ego, to take ownership of these significations and integrate them into one's biography. I was pretty surprised when I read this, given how much the ego has been set up as the kind of fall guy for many of the problems of psychic life. Yet here at the end, we seem to arrive at an understanding of some kind of preserved ego, though one grounded much more in the subject. In some sense, the ego has been enlarged, not in a manner that makes its pathological dimensions more dominant, but in the sense of being viewed by the subject in the manner in which the subject views the big other. While I was editing this video, I looked at the quote again that I was referring to here. So in the spirit of being a little bit more accurate, I thought I'd read this quote directly. And it is to the extent that the ego learns little by little, if one may put it this way, to come to agree with the fundamental discourse, that it can be treated in the same way as the big other is treated. That is, little by little, linked to the subject. In treating the ego in the same way that the big other is treated, here it means that the ego is to be little by little linked back to the subject to reestablish the uninterrupted fundamental discourse. However, I think what I say following this is still relevant because the manner in which the big other is linked to the subject entails having to recognize the other in its radical alterity, in its lack, and as such suggests the possibility of treating the ego differently, not just linking it to the subject, but relating to it in a manner that keeps it open, rather than the tendency for it to engage in a kind of imaginary closure. What would it mean then for the subject to view the ego in the manner the big other is viewed? The big other designates a radical alterity that moves beyond the imaginary, identified with the symbolic order as instantiated for that particular subject. It will also later be the case that the big other lacks or is incomplete. As such, for the subject to view the ego as it does the big other, I understand this to mean to view myself as the question I am to myself, and thus perhaps view oneself through the passion of ignorance. If we are to become our own analysts, and the analyst is not only to occupy the position of the big other, but is also to occupy the passion of ignorance, then this would make sense. This passion embraces the lack that defines me more than any of my history of identifications do. A lack that I've been in flight from my whole life. A flight that constitutes the basis of the neurotic symptoms one experiences. What exactly this means and how this passion of ignorance is different from neurotic doubt will have to be considered as we move through these seminars some more. And so this completes Seminar 2. But before moving on to Seminar 3, I will dedicate one more video to this seminar, in which I'll offer what have been for me the top 10 conceptual contributions Lacan makes here. I want to thank the following for supporting this channel on Patreon. If you wish to support this work on Patreon, the link is below in the description. You can also support this work by liking and sharing this video and subscribing to my channel. As always, thank you for watching, and until next time, Be well.